Live from Washington, D.C., this is Balance of Power with Joe Matthew and Kailey Leinz.
President Trump says the United States will do whatever it takes to achieve its objectives in Iran. Welcome to Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Kailey Leinz. Joe Matthew is off today on what is day 3 of the conflict with Iran. President Trump suggests the bombing campaign could continue for weeks, and he is not ruling out putting troops on the ground. We'll have the latest reporting this hour from Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall live at the White House with analysis from our political panel and from Heather Conley of the American Enterprise Institute. We'll also talk about what this conflict means for the macro economy and oil prices in particular, as Christopher Smart of the Arbroath Group will join me. The conflict in the Middle East, this war between Iran and the U.S. and Israel now in its third day, and President Trump suggesting it could continue for days or weeks more. Speaking at the White House earlier today, he suggested this campaign could last for 4 or 5 weeks, as he had done previously in other interviews, but also suggested that the U.S. military has the capability to go for far longer than that. Just how long, I suppose, will depend on how quickly the U.S. can achieve its objectives, which until earlier today were still pretty loosely defined. But the president tried to make them clear when he spoke earlier.
This was our last best chance to strike what we're doing right now and eliminate the intolerable threats posed by this sick and sinister regime. And they are indeed sick and sinister. Our objectives are clear. First, we're destroying Iran's missile capabilities, and you see that happening on an hourly basis, and their capacity to produce brand new ones, and pretty good ones they make. Second, we're annihilating their navy. We've knocked out already 10 ships.
So those were objectives 1 and 2. The president went on to list a third and a fourth. The third, he said, is ensuring that the world's #1 sponsor of terror can never obtain a nuclear weapon. And the fourth, ensuring that the Iranian regime cannot continue to arm, fund, or direct terrorists outside of its borders. So for more, we turn to Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall, who is live on the North Lawn of the White House. So Tyler, while we did hear this statement from President Trump, once again, he did not answer any questions from reporters.
Right, Kailey, he didn't, and this has been the case since the U.S. launched these military operations over the weekend, though 2 senior administration officials did take some questions from reporters earlier today in what was considered to be the first Pentagon briefing in actually months, with Secretary Pete Hegseth as well as the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Dan Kane. And they reiterated a lot of what we heard from President Trump, including that the U.S. is prepared to sustain this military operation until its objectives are achieved, as you just outlined there. We got a few of them from President Trump. Now, Secretary Hegseth said that this will not be an endless war, in his words, but that Americans should be prepared that it will take time for the U.S. to achieve its goals. In fact, the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Kane, ultimately said that the U.S. right now is currently surging additional resources to the region, as currently hundreds of missions have been deployed by land and by sea, saying that this is going to, quote, continue to scale. This, as we are learning here at Bloomberg News, that regional allies are urging the Trump administration privately to pursue a route of diplomacy. Now, President Trump himself did say in an interview over the weekend he could be open to potential negotiations with the transitory government that is currently in place in Iran, though reports that Iran had reached out to the U.S. for talks was battened down by the country's security chief overnight. President Trump has also, of course, as we've been covering, urged the Iranian people to take over their government. But Kailey, it's really interesting because just within the last hour, we got this report from the AFP saying that a drone hit a fuel tank terminal in Abu Dhabi. Of course, 2 of those top regional allies, according to our reporting, that are urging the Trump administration to find an off-ramp are the UAE and Qatar, as we saw Qatar also take offline a top LNG export facility earlier after being hit in an Iranian drone strike.
Yeah, any further damage to energy infrastructure in the Gulf is going to be something that the oil market and markets more widely very closely watch. Tyler, to your point on what we heard publicly from the Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth and the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Kane, earlier today, I would imagine that there will be more detail than what was given this morning, given when they join others in the administration in briefing lawmakers on Capitol Hill in the coming days.
Right, and this is something that we are closely watching as lawmakers demand more information from the Trump administration. As you well know, we're tracking likely war power votes later this week that are considered to be more symbolic in nature than actually changing the scope or the scale of the Trump administration's plans when it comes to Iran. And that is because congressional lawmakers are demanding more information. Now, it is our understanding that Secretary Rubio will be on Capitol Hill later today and briefing the so-called Gang of Eight lawmakers. We also have reporting that those members on key committees, including Intelligence, Foreign Affairs, and Armed Services, will be given their separate briefings as well. It is something to track very closely here, Kailey, as legality questions come up, and we're hearing from both sides of the aisle that they do want more information pertaining to what the Trump administration says could be a military operation that extends in some cases to 4 or 5 weeks or even further than that until the White House is able to achieve its objectives.
All right, Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall live at the White House for us on Bloomberg TV and radio. Thank you so much. And as we consider what this administration, this U.S. military is willing to do in order to reach those objectives, noteworthy that earlier today in that Pentagon press briefing that Tyler was alluding to, when asked directly about the prospect of putting boots on the ground, this was the response from the Secretary of Defense.
We're not going to go into the exercise of what we will or will not do. I think it's one of those fallacies for a long time that this department or presidents or others should tell the American people this, and our enemies, by the way, here's exactly what we'll do. Here's exactly how long we'll go. Here's exactly how far we'll go. Here's what we're willing to do and not do. It's foolishness. And so President Trump ensures that our enemies understand we'll go as far as we need to go to advance American interests. But we're not dumb about it. You don't have to roll 200,000 people in there and stay for 20 years.
So in summary, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth is not ruling it out. So we want to get more analysis now as we turn to Heather Conley, who is joining me here in our Washington studio. She is non-resident senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, also former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for the Bureau of European and Eurasian Affairs. Heather, thank you so much for joining us in what is such a historic and frankly, very dangerous moment, one could argue, in the Middle East. When we consider what could be necessary in the coming weeks, if the U.S. is really intending on achieving this long list of goals and taking out so much capability that Iran still has, is it going to require more than just an aerial form of combat?
Yeah, it seems to me very clearly that the 4 to 5 week air campaign is going to do and is doing devastating damage to the Iranian regime, to their missile capability. But transforming a government requires what we saw in Iraq and Afghanistan, and that's clearly not what the Trump administration is interested in. As many have said, we don't have experience with changing regimes from the air. We have the experience of Libya, where we tried to change it from the air, and it turned out to be, quite devastating, a fragmentation of the country. So I think this is going to be a test of wills between Iran and the United States, how long they can absorb the hits, the economic hits, the military hits, and now the entire region is swept in this. So this is no longer a U.S.-Iranian 12-day war as we saw last year. This is now a regional conflict, and it has unintended consequences, as we saw today with Kuwait, responding to a defensive need, but shooting down 3 American jets. So that's going to happen more and more, unfortunately, the longer this operation goes forward.
Yeah, 3 F-15s lost, though it's worth noting all 6 pilots did safely eject, though 4 lives of service members have been lost to this point. To what you were just speaking about, though, Heather, the idea that you can't achieve regime change, at least historically, in this way. It's interesting that administration officials aren't really using that kind of regime change language. Instead, what President Trump at least was describing was, we want to guarantee that Iran is no longer going to be able to fund or direct terrorists outside of its borders. Thinking about the proxy network here. Can you guarantee that that will not be the case without new leadership, without complete regime change?
Kailey, it's a great question. And what we understand of the Iranian regime for the past 47 years, the nuclear component is essential to that regime. So in some ways, we're saying the same thing. Without an Iran having a nuclear capability, this regime cannot survive. So I think really what we're saying is total elimination of the nuclear element means that this would not be the same government in place. So it's the same thing.
Is it realistic to think that the Iranian people, some kind of opposition movement, can rise up to form a government? Because the president is actively calling for that. He said in a video statement yesterday, now it's up to you.
So this is where what we've seen, I mean, the horrific attacks in January, this regime will brutally suppress the Iranian people. The Iranian people do not have arms themselves to fight against this regime. So again, and I appreciate that one of the targets is the internal structures of the Iranian Revolutionary Guards to try to break some of that structure. But at this point, it is unlikely that these citizens would be able to overcome the regime unless they would lay down their arms, and we have no evidence that they are doing that right now.
So when we consider this wider cast of characters, then, it was striking to me that in an interview with ABC yesterday, President Trump said the U.S. had identified possible candidates to take over Iran if the supreme leader was taken out. But he said, quote, the attack was so successful, it knocked out most of the candidates. It's not going to be anybody we were thinking because they're all dead. Second or third place is dead. What does that say to you, Heather?
So, yes, I mean, it was a devastating decapitation of the first few hours of the regime.
But could we also have miscalculated?
Well, look, the Iranians have an interim council, Supreme Council right now. And in fact, the head of their National Security Council, Larijani, is really calling the shots right now. So, yes, there is disorganization, and we can see that with some of the attacks that aren't clearly coordinated, but they still have an interim internal structure. And this will not be the United States selecting the leader to control this, as we saw in Venezuela. This would have to be a complete collapse of the current regime, in my view, complete laying down of arms to allow another potential candidate outside the country to come in. But again, how can you do that without a ground force? Although it seemed the administration was suggesting all options are on the table, boots on the ground could be introduced, although I find that very unlikely.
So when we consider whoever's making the decisions right now in Iran, let's talk about the decisions they are making. The choice to go after other Gulf states, that we're seeing bombs and sirens over places like Dubai and Abu Dhabi, that we're talking, as you alluded to, about damage that we don't know necessarily, according to the AFP, just how widespread the damage is to that fuel tank terminal in particular, but damage to energy infrastructure. Is Iran essentially deciding to, and I don't want to use this phrase glibly because we are talking about war, but essentially blow it all up?
Yeah, I mean, there is some, when you have a regime that is now, this is existential to their survival. I believe their calculation is to widen this war, impose as many costs on the global economy, therefore the American economy, as much as possible, to try to bring a change in the Trump administration's posture as well as Israel. So this is where, for as long as it takes, I just want everyone to hold that thought, because if this is going to go on for 4 to 5 weeks, continued operations, that means the Iranians can continue to fly drones and missiles and create economic havoc in the Strait, in the global economy. This is to widen the conflict, make those costs as significant as possible to try to bring change. So this has got unintended consequences, a spiraling of both the human costs potentially for our U.S. Armed Forces, but also incredibly high global economic costs that I think we're not quite calculating in a 5, 6, potentially longer conflict.
So you would see a sustained closure of the Strait of Hormuz is likely here?
I would, simply because this is the Iranian advantage to impose as much global economic costs as they can. So as long as they can. So the question is whether Iran can sustain this. Do they have the missile and drone production and capabilities to continue to attack across the region for the next several weeks? Or will the U.S. and Israeli campaign be able to stop their ability to do that? That's the test that we will see.
Well, and I'm glad you said the U.S. and Israeli campaign, because I don't want to lose sight of the fact that this is not the U.S. going handling it alone, even if President Trump were to want to pursue some kind of off-ramp, or American casualties get to a level, or gas prices get to a level that he no longer is willing to tolerate. Can we necessarily say that the same pressures will exist for Israel?
Right. And certainly Israel sees a critical window of opportunity here to really accomplish a transformation of the Middle East. And I think, look, we cannot say that that won't happen. There could be an opportunity for complete transformation here. It's difficult to see that pathway forward. I think this would be something, if the U.S. would begin to pull back, it would have to be a very close consultation with Israel, with the Israeli Defense Forces, as there was close coordination as this attack was beginning. So it would be something that would be challenging for Israel. I think they want to seize this incredible moment, but we'll see what the political and economic costs are for President Trump to bear here at home the longer this goes.
Well, and so when we think about that political cost in our final moments here, Heather, more widely, this was a president who said he did not want any more wars, that he wanted to be a bringer of peace. He campaigned as someone who was going to be much more an isolationist than an interventionist. Whether you're looking at what's happening with Iran now, or Venezuela, or potentially what we could see with Cuba, for example, are we learning that actually this president may be one of the most interventionists in modern history? He
is very interventionalist. I would say he's also an internationalist. He really seeks the international stage, and whether it's negotiating peace deals or inflicting military action to try to transform the situation, this is perhaps the most international president we have seen. But this is a far cry from focusing on the domestic agenda, affordability, and cost of living. And those are the two forces he is going to have to reconcile with in the coming months.
Well, especially as we get closer to the midterms in November, it's not just about him, who cannot run for re-election, obviously, but the Republican Party more widely. Heather, so appreciate you joining us with your insight. Heather Conley is non-resident senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, also former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for the Bureau of European and Eurasian Affairs. And what Heather was just touching on, the notion of the political consequences of this conflict, how it will play for both Republicans and Democrats, what role Congress will play if we are to see further operations in the Middle East when it comes to war powers. We'll get into all of that with our political panel next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Welcome back to Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. And of course, Washington will get a lot busier over the next few days as Congress makes their return to town. We are expecting that members of Congress will be briefed by senior administration officials over the coming days about the operations ongoing in Iran, which again are in their third day. And President Trump suggests that it could continue for weeks to come and is not ruling out putting boots on the ground. He says, and to quote him directly via the New York Post, he has no yips about that. But would Congress have yips about that? Should Congress play a role constitutionally in declaring formally war here? Of course, if you listen to most Democrats, their answer would be yes. It certainly was the case when we spoke to Democratic Congresswoman Madeleine Dean of Pennsylvania last night.
Only Congress has the power to declare war. Again, because we are closest to the people, and no power to declare war should be in a single hand. Again, what I worry about is an escalation of this fighting and an incendiary message around the region and to our allies and friends in the region, not to mention the economic impact. This president was elected to reduce prices for everybody, to get things under control and to bring peace. What are we watching now?
And of course, while Democrats are beating the drum toward a war powers vote, it's not to say that Republicans, at least some of them, aren't either. One Republican, Congressman Tom Massey, who of course often finds himself at odds with the administration, is going to be one of the co-sponsors of a war powers resolution vote in the House this week. But there's another Republican to watch as well, Congressman Warren Davidson of Ohio, who posted this on X earlier today. Quote, "Congress declares war. America is at war. Congress did not declare war." He says this week we'll either see real intel, hear a persuasive explanation with a defined mission and declare war and authorize a mission, or Congress must pass this war powers resolution and cease work in Iran. For more, we turn now to our political panel here on Bloomberg TV and radio. Bloomberg Politics contributors Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino are with me. Rick, Stonecourt Capital partner and Republican strategist. Jeanne, our Democratic analyst and democracy visiting fellow at Harvard Kennedy School's Ash Center. Jeanne, when we think about the idea that it does seem there are at least some Republicans that are wary of this effort going on without congressional approval, will a war powers resolution be anything more than a signal, than symbolic, because President Trump can just veto it?
Yeah, Kailey, I think it will definitely be symbolic. It also is political to the extent that it's forcing all members to go on the record. And as we all lived through when that happened with the war in Iraq, that can come back to have devastating consequences for political futures going forward if people are on the wrong side of history. So for those reasons, it's important, but it doesn't seem like, even if it passed the House and Senate, that they would be able to break a Senate filibuster. So from that extent, it's symbolic. And of course, it's one in many reminders as to why elections are so important, because that's really going to be the opportunity for the public. And of course, voting begins tomorrow for the primaries in Texas and North Carolina, to be able to voice their view as to how they feel about this and so many other things going on in Washington, D.C. today.
Well, so Rick, weigh in here as to whether or not congressional authorization should be necessary. Are we not at war at present?
Well, there is something called the authorization of military force that was passed right after 9/11 that gives the President of the United States the ability to deploy forces in a defensive way. This is the rationale, I think, that the Trump administration has chosen to take, saying things like we were under an imminent threat and that that Iran regime poses such. So there are legal frameworks that have been used by previous presidents, both Republicans and Democrats, since 9/11 to allow them to deploy forces in efforts such as this. Look, there's no question that there should be a debate in Congress around the use of military force in this instance and other instances. There was a discussion around the 12-day war that really didn't ultimately go anywhere, but it's a healthy debate to have amongst the public, and the Congress's role is to do that. Whether or not they could sustain a presidential veto on a war powers resolution is highly skeptical, but it's worth a discussion. And ultimately, if Congress really wants to do something about their war powers, they ought to pass a law that takes away the ability for a president to use an authorization of military force. They put that into effect, they can take it away. So there are many things for this Congress and future Congresses to consider when they think about the balance of power with the military.
Well, when we think about the composition of future Congresses, Rick, that's going to be decided in November. And to Jeanne's point about even if a war powers resolution can't do anything, if the president can veto it, it does put members on the record. If you are a vulnerable Republican in a swing district, knowing that at least the Trump economy is not overwhelmingly popular, and looking what's happening with oil and by extension what is likely to happen with gas prices, what kind of position does that put you in?
Yeah, I mean, when you change from a discussion about the proper role of Congress in the Constitution and you want to talk about politics, that's a totally different kettle of fish. And in this case, sure, nobody wants to be the party in power going into a midterm elections talking about a war in Iran. They want to be talking about affordability because that's ultimately what the voters care most about. And by and large, voters will give a little leeway to the president, but probably not their congressman. And so it's going to be a tough slog. It was going to be a tough slog anyway for Republicans in this midterm because of the situation that the public feels like they're in economically. But this is kind of piling on at this stage. Use of resources, putting our bravest men and women at risk. These are all things that weigh heavily on voters. And I suspect this will be resolved before the midterms, but the question is how much before the midterms can Republicans potentially get past this in order to really address the issues that are the burning kitchen table issues like inflation and affordability and cost of goods.
Well, and so on that affordability question, Jeanne, as we consider gas prices, but also what this could do simply to consumer confidence, if gas prices are indeed higher, if there is concern about how this conflict could spread elsewhere, maybe even in the homeland, if we consider the threat of potential terrorism here at home, which is always a concern when it comes to Iran, how quickly would you expect that materialize, and how lasting, to Rick's point, will that be? Does that necessarily something that will be sustained through November?
It absolutely, on the issue of affordability, inflation, cost of living, oil, all those things you mentioned and more, Kailey, those will sustain. And I think it is the height of a profound misunderstanding of what has happened and the extent of it this weekend to suggest this is going to be like Venezuela, a one and done. We're going to get in and out. You know, the president is talking about weeks. That really depends on what his objective is, which, by the way, he has not been clear about at all. And anybody who knows Iran knows that this is not going to be resolved. We are not talking about Venezuela. We are talking about a theocracy with a deep state with 93 million people, a long history. And so these kinds of things are not resolved easily or quickly. And even if you suggest that the president has these objectives of regime change, well, let's just stop and think about that. We are in a war of choice. We have taken preemptive action to kill a leader of another country. And we are talking about regime change. In a regime like Iran, that is going to take months and resources, all of that impacting what happens here domestically. And I think this is really must be very frustrating for Republicans in Congress who are going to go on the record and be forced, to Rick's point, to defend this when they themselves followed this president down this garden path of repeatedly saying, we are not going to get entangled in foreign wars, of saying about Kamala Harris, she was going to get us involved in this endless war in Iran, and we would never do such a thing. And yet here they find themselves. And stunning enough, we've only had a few drop-offs like Massey and others so far, and they will pay the price of that electorally. So this thing has legs, and the president seemingly just doesn't care. He wants to make his name historically, and the impact on all the other Republicans seems to be, his view is, let it be damned.
Well, and while all of this is going on, it's happening as the Department of Homeland Security is currently shut down. It is not funded. Jeanne, does this actually put more pressure on the Democrats to go ahead and break the stalemate and to fund it, if not to guarantee the safety of the homeland, or to do the best that they can?
Yeah, I think there's going to be pressure. And to your point earlier, we heard that horrible shooting in Austin, people were speculating in the security arena, there may be ties to what's going on in Iran. We are vulnerable. They are vulnerable in Europe for certain. There will be pressure, but at this point, I don't see Democrats buckling on their very common sense requests to the administration and to the Republicans in Congress, the demasking, the better training, and all of those things. So there will be pressure, but I don't think it's enough yet that they are going to sort of pull back on any of those demands of ICE agents.
Rick, we just have a minute left, but same question to you. Does this unlock something?
Yeah, I think it could. Certainly, the Republican pushback now is that we're going to have a lot more risk in the homeland and need to be ready for business. Really, it's not something I would think the Democrats want to spend a lot of time on. I mean, they have the advantage of the economic argument. They want to talk about that. Homeland Security is getting in the way of a broader, much more politically salient conversation. They ought to open up that agency as soon as they can.
All right, Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino, Bloomberg Politics contributors, the both of them, thank you so much for joining us on Balance of Power. And when we consider the economic impact of this conflict, that's a conversation we're going to focus on ahead, as Christopher Smart, the founder and managing partner of Arbroath Group and former special assistant to the president on the National Economic Council during the Obama administration, will be joining me as we take a look at oil prices north of $70 a barrel on both WTI and Brent. That's still ahead here on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. And thanks for being with us here on Bloomberg TV and radio on this day 3 of the conflict with Iran, where, of course, we have seen basically a halting of traffic, even if not formally, in the Strait of Hormuz, a waterway, which, of course, is where we see about a fifth of the world's oil and natural gas flow through each and every day, or at least a usual day. It's not happening right now, which is why you're seeing more of a risk premium coming into the energy space. You see it in natural gas prices. Certainly you see it in oil, though, as Charlie was alluding to, we are well off of the highs right now, up just about 6 percentage points on both WTI and Brent. They're trading just shy of 71 and around $77.50 respectively. The question is how much higher could those prices go if we see a more sustained disruption to energy flows? And is there an underpricing of the risks here? Certainly it seems Jeff Curry, who's Chief Strategy Officer of Energy Pathways at Carlyle Group, thinks so. This was him on Bloomberg earlier today.
This market going into this was priced for a high level of complacency. We've been talking about a security premium in energy prices now for over a year. I think this is it. This is going to be a structural repricing, and I would not fade this current spike. The probability that this thing gets protracted in other regions, I think, is quite high. So the volatility is going to be high. The situation's fluid. I wouldn't fade it.
So let's get some more analysis with Mike McGlone, who's senior commodities strategist with Bloomberg Intelligence and is joining us now from Miami. So, Mike, certainly we are seeing a spike today. Yes, oil above $70 a barrel is nothing to sneeze at. But are you surprised that this move isn't bigger?
No, and actually, I'd like to say sold to you, Jeff, because there is a lot of motivated sellers in this market, and that's the people who are actually creating the pressure on prices, and that's the Western Hemisphere producers. The U.S. and Canada have a massive surplus, many times what Iran can actually export, and now we're seeing potentially the beginning of end of what has been a bear market that's bounced in crude oil and the potential towards a much safer world, which is bad for gold, too. So I look at this as, okay, it's been a bear market. This is the first good chance to sell crude oil this year. Basically, Brent at last year's high, $82.63 a barrel. It's got to stay above that level. And Kailey, you have to think about what's going to make it stay above that level. Something really bad happening. And I think the U.S. military is pretty well covered for that not to happen.
Well, just to find what bad happening would mean. Is it a full closure for the Strait of Hormuz for a sustained period of time, days or weeks? Is it the infrastructure of an OPEC member getting damaged? What is bad?
Well, all the above are bad for crude oil. I mean, for global production and supply, which boosts prices up. But it's very low probability. I think we're going to have a good sense by Friday if there can actually be a sustained closure of the Strait of Hormuz by antagonists and leadership using military action. You got to think the U.S. government has had 4 decades to plan for this. I think is going to plan that out, and I'm not worried about it. The key thing, Kailey, though, is the more these prices stay up, the more the bear market kicks in, because there is a global glut going on, and it's really the Western Hemisphere. So this is, the answers have changed. The questions are still the same. So this is the key thing. It's also, there's other things happening today. You're seeing no volatility in the stock market, or very little. It doesn't really seem to care. Silver's tried to go above 100 and it's collapsed. Even gold trying to go up. So I think the most of the geopolitical bid in most markets, potentially crude oil and silver and gold, are going to reach an end game today. And things going wrong, you have to have some major setbacks for the U.S. military. And the bottom line is closing the Strait of Hormuz, major supply disruptions, and typically, as we learned in 2019 when Saudi's facilities were hit by Iran proxy, that stuff comes back right away.
Well, does your same thesis hold for LNG? What about natural gas?
Well, that's the key thing. You're seeing that happen in Europe. Natural gas prices recently have spiked about 50%. 20% of natural gas in the world goes through the Strait. But again, that's all for Europe. It's kind of their problem. For us in the U.S., natural gas prices are down 20% in the year. We have a major glut, even after a very cold winter. And there'll be more natural LNG coming from the U.S. going that way. And, Bloomberg New Energy Finance predicts we'll have a glut of LNG by 2030. So this is, I think, a blip in that trend towards deflationary forces in commodities, crude oil and grains. And right now it's a bounce.
All right, Mike McGlone, Senior Commodities Strategist at Bloomberg Intelligence. Thank you so much. And as we turn to another voice on this matter, it seems he might agree with some of what Mike McGlone just said. Christopher Smart is joining me. He is founder and managing partner of the Arbroath Group and also former special assistant to the president at the National Economic Council during the Obama administration. Welcome back, Christopher, to Bloomberg TV and radio. Your research out today says the Iran war doesn't matter to global investors. You write the most likely scenarios do not include a major disruption in the world's energy supplies or its financial markets. But how high is the risk that there is another scenario that does cause those things?
Well, Kailey, great to be with you. I think, as Mike just put it, there are risks out there. There are a lot of uncertainties built into the legalities of this intervention, the domestic politics of this intervention, and what might come out of it in terms of unintended long-term consequences for the Middle East. But I think your base case, with a very high probability, has to be going into this conflict that there's going to be one big loser in all of this, and that is Iran, and Iran's armed forces in particular. You have had already last year the Iranian Air Force seriously damaged by the U.S. and Israeli bombing. As we speak, the Iranian Navy is being decimated. And so the odds of Iran actually blocking the Straits of Hormuz or any other non-state actor doing it for any length of time is very, very low. And so while there's so many questions around the future of Iran, it seems to me that there aren't that many questions around the future of the world's oil supply, and in particular against the backdrop of pretty good supplies and ample OPEC capabilities to increase their own production.
Well, Christopher, I was speaking with Bob McNally of Rapidan Energy earlier today, who suggested the thing that those who aren't thinking this could lead to a sustained spike in oil prices are missing is the idea that the oil price is the only real leverage that Iran has now. They have to create that kind of economic pain if they want to be able to persuade President Trump to stop this campaign. So are you effectively saying that this will not result in the kind of economic pain that might change the mind of President Trump?
Well, I think first of all, Iran is very quickly losing even that last little bit of leverage, not just having lost its senior leadership, but as I say, having its military completely decimated. And I think that's the clear path of this conflict. And it's going to happen in days and weeks, not months and years. So markets, I think, are going to look through that, see that the odds of that, which were small to begin with, are going to vanish before our eyes, and that they'll be able to see that against the backdrop, as I say, of good supply, lots of reserves, is not going to move the oil price very much. And as consequential as the Middle East is for its own region, for other geopolitical considerations, really the only way it impacts the global economy and the global financial markets are through the oil price.
Well, so when we consider then the wider economic impact here, if it's not going to be pressure on oil prices upward and therefore creating a kind of reinflationary impact, Christopher, when we're thinking about what this means, say, for monetary policy, does this change any part of the calculation for the Federal Reserve? Does it encourage them to stay on hold for longer, or do they effectively say what you're saying, which is on net, when we think about what this means for the economy, the answer is not much?
I think when you're looking at monetary policy, you're still thinking hard about when Kevin Warsh is going to be confirmed and what kind of rate cuts he's going to be able to push through. And, to the extent that this conflict comes up in that conversation, how much does this brief spike in oil prices feed through to the U.S. consumer going into the summer months, again, in the Western Hemisphere, having this glut? I just don't see how that's going to play into any sort of long-term serious conversation around where interest rates are headed.
All right, fair enough, at least when it comes to here at home. But are there other areas in the world, Christopher, that we should be watching that could have kind of a trickle-on effect in terms of the global economy? I'm thinking of China here, which gets a lot of oil from Iran. If there's a disruption to that, does that not have an impact in the second largest economy that we could feel by extension?
No, I think there are areas that might get there might be some follow through, as you say, in Asian markets. China may have some, although Chinese domestic reserves are also quite ample to be able to withstand, a brief interruption of supply. So, again, that's where there is more vulnerability, but still, to me, not a high signal that should lead you to think about selling any Chinese assets based on that probability. There are probably potential blowbacks, to the LNG price in Europe, as you just heard. I think, generally speaking, the real economic impact is going to come not in this immediate period of months, but probably over the course of years, where a region is going to be reshaped. And, do you get a settlement now between Israel and in Gaza and the Palestinians? Do you get some sort of reorientation now of recognition between Saudi Arabia and Israel? That's the kind of thing that can really transform the investment possibilities within the Middle East and then maybe have some broader impact. But again, the immediate effect of this war, it's really hard to draw a line, to my mind, between between what's going on and what we're seeing and a sustained impact on GDP this year and your market forecasts.
Well, Christopher, what about when we consider that obviously this war is not happening in a vacuum? It's happening against a background of more intervention by the United States in many different areas of the world, Venezuela included. Clearly, they have their eyes on Cuba as well. President Trump is gearing up at the end of this month to have a meeting with Xi Jinping. When you look at the wider landscape of a more interventionist, potentially United States, does that not need to elevate some kind of geopolitical risk premium beyond just what you would need to factor into your calculations for the Middle East, but this idea that President Trump is clearly not shying away from military conflict?
Yeah, I think that's a big question that we all are going to wrestle with, again, not over the next few months, but probably over the next few years. What kind of an actor is the United States under President Trump, under any of his successors? How much can our allies count on coordinating action together? Clearly, this was one where the Europeans were left in the dark until the last minute. The relationship, does this, questions lots of us have been raising, does this kind of behavior in Venezuela and Iran make it easier for Vladimir Putin to pursue his aims in Ukraine or Xi Jinping in Taiwan? Or does it make them think twice that, gosh, maybe the U.S. is ready to use military force? It's not just talk. So I think those are difficult answers to give right now, but clearly those are the right questions to be focused on. Again, not something that's going to move markets right now, but continues to raise those questions around the dollar as a safe haven, the United States is the best place to make a long-term investment, and how reliable and predictable the U.S. will be as a global actor.
All right, Christopher Smart, really appreciate you joining us with your analysis. He's founder and managing partner of the Arbroath Group, also, of course, former special assistant to President Obama's National Economic Council. Christopher noting he does not see a sustained rise in oil prices or sustained economic impact here, but we are seeing oil moving higher to the tune of about 6 percentage points or even more on Brent today. $71 a barrel on WTI, $77.68 on Brent.